This is an ABC News special report. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
And we are coming on the air right now because the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is about to make an announcement related to the Mueller investigation. But there you see President Trump and the First Lady Melania Trump meeting with the Queen today in Great Britain. Of course, the President coming off that NATO summit yesterday and his meeting with the Prime Minister, Theresa May, earlier today, and that press conference he had this morning also in Great Britain. This is, of course, ahead of his meeting on Monday in Helsinki with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Black tie dinner last night also in Great Britain. This is one of the highlights of the trip, of course, for the President and the First Lady. President Trump has made headlines, of course, in Great Britain with his criticism of Theresa May, his praise of one of her opponents who just left the government, the Foreign Minister, Boris Johnson. And this trip a long time in coming, protests across Great Britain, but the President being met there by Queen Elizabeth. The President expects to spend the weekend at one of his golf resorts in Scotland, Turnberry. Might get a little golf in, also planning to prepare for, of course, for that meeting with President Putin. The President likes the pomp of these trips. Remember that big parade, military parade he had in Paris? Liked it so much that he's asked our military to replicate it. That's going to come up in November of this year. On the business side, it has been a controversial trip. The President said in his meeting with the NATO leaders that he was willing to go it alone if they didn't follow through on their pledges to increase defense spending. But they were able to get a joint communique, getting large agreement on policy. And the headlines the President made on his way into Great Britain surprised the British Prime Minister Theresa May. They're trying to clean that up now as well. This part of the trip ceremonial. As we see that now, we have learned now that the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein will be announcing an indictment of Russian nationals related to the hack of the DNC back in June 2016. Pierre Thomas is in the room where Rosenstein is set to appear. Pierre, what do we know?
Well, George, the indictment comes just as the president is going to meet with Vladimir Putin. It charges that 12 Russian nationals associated with Russian military intelligence hacked the DNC and then provided to get that information out to harm the campaign of Hillary Rodham Clinton. So the bottom line is that they're charging new indictments today against Russian nationals in connection with the hack of the DNC, George.
And all of those Russian nationals are members of the Russian intelligence service. That comes on top of the 13 Russian nationals and the three entities that were indicted for interfering in the election back in February. I want to bring in Chris Christie as well, former governor of New Jersey, advisor to the president, has been an advisor in front of the president for a long time. Chris, the timing here unmistakable, just a few days before the president's summit with Vladimir Putin.
No, it's a very aggressive move by the special counsel's office to announce these indictments ahead of it, especially in light of some of the answers the president gave to questions regarding how much he would challenge President Putin on the idea that they were meddling in the U.S. election. It's unmistakable to conclude that Bob Mueller wanted to do the best he could to make sure that that was no longer a debatable point on this issue.
Well, and on that, Chris, you now have unanimous findings of the American intelligence agencies and now 25 Russian nationals indicted by Robert Mueller.
Now, listen, George, I've all along said that there's really no debate about whether the Russians tried to meddle in the election. I think it's very clear that they did. There's a unanimity among our intelligence agencies that is stark. And now you're finding that a special counsel with grand jury subpoena authority to get information, and probably more information than even some congressional committees have had has come to the conclusion, and more importantly, George, a grand jury of ordinary Americans has found probable cause to believe that they meddled with it. That's what makes this different and more powerful.
And much more
normal
difficult.
Americans have listened to this evidence, not members of the deep state or anything else. Normal Americans, they've reached the same conclusion.
And John, Carl, we now have Robert Mueller establishing a conspiracy of Russian nationals. He's also, of course, charged Paul Manafort, the president's former campaign chairman, with tax fraud and other violations. He's reached guilty pleas with Rick Gates, the deputy campaign manager of the campaign. Also, Michael Flynn, the president's former national security advisor. George Papadopoulos, also on the campaign. The big open question: will he find that any members, anyone connected to President Trump, cooperated with this conspiracy?
And there's no indication of that yet, George, but it's notable that at the press conference the president had today with Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, he referred once again to the Mueller investigation as a witch hunt and added a new adjective to it, said it was a rigged witch hunt. So he went on the attack today against Robert Mueller, and now we see Mueller coming out with these indictments. I think the timing is incredibly significant here, George. The fact that the president is about to be sitting down with Vladimir Putin at a summit meeting in Helsinki. Mueller can do these indictments whenever he wants. He has decided to do it essentially on the eve of that summit. The summit is on Monday. We are here on Friday. And it makes, as Governor Christie points out, it makes it clear that this will be a subject of that summit meeting.
And John, it comes at the time when we know there's been a big back and forth between the president's legal team and Robert Mueller over whether or not to have the president sit down with Robert Mueller for an interview on some of these questions, and it's become pretty unmistakable there as well in my last interview with Rudy Giuliani and several others that he's given in recent days, that the president is very unlikely to sit down for that interview.
I would say it's about a little bit north of a 0% chance that interview takes place, despite the fact that the president has said over and over again, including at least 2 times directly to me, that he would 100% sit down for an interview. It seems clear that he is now taking the advice of his lawyers, advice that's been consistent, not to do that interview. But, George, to your point, that the list of indictments is piling up here. It seems that it gets harder and harder to dismiss the special counsel investigation as a witch hunt. It is coming up with indictments, although, as the White House, I'm sure, will point out, nothing anywhere, at least nothing yet, that suggests any connection with anybody on the Trump campaign.
Not yet. Pierre Thomas, we're learning more about this indictment?
Yes, we are. They're naming and shaming 12 Russian nationals. Here's the Deputy Attorney General.
Well, good afternoon. Today, a grand jury in the District of Columbia returned an indictment presented by the Special Counsel's Office. The indictment charges 12 Russian military officers by name for conspiring to interfere with the 2016 presidential election. 11 of the defendants are charged with conspiring to hack into computers, steal documents, and release those documents with the intent to interfere in the election. One of those defendants and a 12th Russian military officer are charged with conspiring to infiltrate computers of organizations involved in administering elections, including state boards of election, secretaries of state, and companies that supply software used to administer elections. According to the allegations in the indictment, the defendants worked for 2 units of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, known as the GRU. The units engaged in active cyber operations to interfere in the 2016 presidential election. There was one unit that engaged in active cyber operations by stealing information, and a different unit that was responsible for disseminating the stolen information. The defendants used 2 techniques to steal information. First, they used a scheme known as spear phishing, which involves sending misleading email messages and tricking the users into disclosing their passwords and security information. Second, the defendants hacked into computer networks and installed malicious software that allowed them to spy on users and capture keystrokes, take screenshots, and exfiltrate or remove data from those computers. The defendants accessed email accounts of volunteers and employees of a U.S. presidential campaign, including the campaign chairman, starting in March of 2016. They also hacked into the computer networks of a congressional campaign committee and a national political committee. The defendants covertly monitored the computers, implanted hundreds of files containing malicious computer code, and stole emails and other documents. The conspirators created fictitious online personas, including DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0, and they used those personas to release information, including thousands of stolen emails and other documents, beginning in June of 2016. The defendants falsely claimed that DC Leaks was a group of American hackers and that Guccifer 2.0 was a lone Romanian hacker. In fact, both were created and controlled by the Russian GRU. In addition to releasing documents directly to the public, the defendants transferred stolen documents to another organization that is not identified by name in the indictment, and they used that organization as a pass-through to release the documents. They discussed the timing of the release in an attempt to enhance the impact on the election. In an effort to conceal their connections to Russia, the defendants used a network of computers around the world, and they paid for it using cryptocurrencies. The conspirators corresponded with several Americans during the course of the conspiracy through the internet. There's no allegation in this indictment that the Americans knew they were corresponding with Russian intelligence officers. In a second related conspiracy, Russian GRU officers hacked the website of a state election board and stole information about 500,000 voters. They also hacked into computers of a company that supplied software used to verify voter registration information. They targeted state and local officials responsible for administering elections, and they sent spear phishing emails to people involved in administering elections, including attaching malicious software. The indictment includes 11 criminal allegations and a forfeiture allegation. Count 1 charges 11 defendants for conspiring to access computers without authorization and to damage those computers in connection with efforts to interfere with the presidential election. Counts 2 through 9 charge those 11 defendants with aggravated identity theft by employing the usernames and passwords of victims in order to commit computer fraud. Count 10 charges those 11 defendants with money laundering for transferring cryptocurrencies through a web of transactions in order to purchase computer servers, register domains, and make other payments in furtherance of their hacking activities while trying to conceal their connections to Russia. Count 11 charges 2 defendants for a separate conspiracy to access computers without authorization and to damage those computers in connection with efforts to infiltrate computers used to administer elections. Finally, the indictment seeks the forfeiture of property involved in the criminal activity. There is no allegation in this indictment that any American citizen committed a crime. There's no allegation that the conspiracy changed the vote count or affected any election result. The special counsel's investigation is ongoing, and there will be no comments by the special counsel at this time. Assistant Attorney General John Demers is here with me today because we intend to transition responsibility for this indictment to the Justice Department's National Security Division while we await the apprehension of the defendants. Principal Associate Deputy Attorney General Ed O'Callaghan is also with me, and he's been assisting in managing the special counsel investigation. I want to caution you, the people who speculate about federal investigations usually do not know all of the relevant facts. We do not try cases on television or in congressional hearings. Most anonymous leaks are not from the government officials who are actually conducting these investigations. We follow the rule of law, which means that we follow procedures and we reserve judgment. We complete our investigations and we evaluate all of the relevant evidence before we reach any conclusion. That is how the American people expect their Department of Justice to operate, and that is how our department is going to operate. In our justice system, everyone who's charged with a crime is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty. It should go without saying the people who are not charged with a crime also are presumed innocent. The indictment was returned today because prosecutors determined that the evidence was sufficient to present these allegations to a federal grand jury. Our analysis is based solely on the facts, the law, and Department of Justice policies. I briefed President Trump about these allegations earlier this week. The President is fully aware of the Department's actions today. In my remarks, I have not identified the victims. When we confront foreign interference in American elections, it's important for us to avoid thinking politically as Republicans or Democrats, and instead to think patriotically as Americans. Our response must not depend on which side was victimized. The Internet allows foreign adversaries to attack America in new and unexpected ways. Free and fair elections are always hard-fought and contentious. There will always be adversaries who seek to exacerbate our divisions and try to confuse, divide, and conquer us. So long as we are united in our commitment to the values enshrined in the Constitution, they will not succeed. The partisan warfare, fueled by modern technology, does not fairly reflect the grace, dignity, and unity of the American people. The blame for election interference belongs to the criminals who committed election interference. We need to work together to hold the perpetrators accountable, and we need to keep moving forward to preserve our values, protect against future interference, and defend America. I have time to take a few questions.
General Rosenstein, quick question for you, sir. Number one, the timing today on the eve of the president's meeting with Putin, can you talk about that? And also, just today, the president described the Mueller investigation as a witch hunt. Your response.
The timing, as I mentioned, is a function of the collection of the facts, the evidence, and the law, and a determination that it was sufficient to present the indictment at this time. As I mentioned, I did brief the president. With regard to the nature of the investigation, I only comment on the evidence. The evidence that is reflected in our indictments and in our charges represents a determination by prosecutors and agents without regard to politics that we believe the evidence is sufficient to justify the charges.
Harry? Yes, Deputy Attorney General, I know you've talked about the fact that, in your view, the evidence doesn't show any votes were changed as a result of this hacking. But you did say that a company used as a pass-through coordinated with these defendants to enhance the timing of the release and the impact on the election. Can you talk a little bit about what the evidence you have shows in that respect?
So what I've talked about today is what is alleged in the indictment. We know that, according to the allegations in the indictment, the goal of the conspirators was to have an impact in the election. What impact they may have had, or what their motivation may have been independently of what's required to prove this offense, is a matter of speculation. That's not our responsibility. What I said is there's no allegation in the indictment about it, and that's not our charge.
In terms of the state election information, you said about 500,000 voters information was collected. Is there any evidence that what the Russians did with that information? And is there any evidence of other states being successfully penetrated by the Russians?
I think that it's important for you to understand what I've told you are the allegations that are included in the indictment. The FBI and other intelligence community agencies are working constantly to defend against cyber attacks in the United States. This case is just about one particular effort that was made during the 2016 election. The efforts of our department, of the Department of Homeland Security, of other federal agencies, and of all of the state election boards throughout the country are ongoing. And those efforts preceded this indictment, and they're going to post-date this indictment. So we have continued to share any relevant intelligence with all of our partners. It would take a longer time to talk about this, but there is a concerted and organized effort by the federal government to make sure that we do deter and prevent any sort of cyber attacks on our elections, and that we harden our election systems to prevent against any kind of intrusions.
We'll take last question from Jen.
Deputy Attorney General, you mentioned that you briefed President Trump on this earlier this week. Did he indicate his support for this action, and what was his reaction?
I'll allow the President to speak for himself. Obviously, it was important for the President to know what information we've uncovered, because he's got to make very important decisions for the country. So he needs to understand what evidence we have of foreign election interference. Thank you very much.
Well, there you have it right there. The Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein announcing that Special Counsel Robert Mueller has indicted 12 Russian nationals, members of the Russian intelligence service, for conspiring to interfere in our elections by hacking the computers of the DCCC, the DNC, Hillary Clinton's campaign. You saw Rod Rosenstein would not name the victims there in his press conference, even though they were named in the indictment. And we have one of the chief targets on the phone right now, John Podesta, who is the campaign chairman for Hillary Clinton, whose email was hacked back in April of 2016 and released over the course of the campaign. Your reaction to these indictments, John?
Well, George, I think at the heart of all this has always been the fact that crimes were committed against individual Americans, including myself, but also crimes committed against the American democracy. And I think that, Donald Trump likes to describe this as a witch hunt. Well, we just found some witches, and they were indicted. I think this is something that people knew had happened all along, that underlying all this, crimes were committed, and that's why the Mueller investigation has been so important and why it needs to be continued in an unfettered manner.
As you saw, Rod Rosenstein is not making the allegation in this indictment that these hacks changed the course of the election. Your view on that?
Well, look, I think when an election is so close, it's hard to put your finger on any one particular issue, but clearly this had some impact. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of noise in the call, George. But I think that the decision to dribble these out over the course of a month was intended to hurt our campaign, and to what extent it was used in order to fuel other activities that were done by both the Russians and American sources. I think we'll have to leave to history to judge.
And John, one final point: the indictment laying this right at the feet of Vladimir Putin, his military intelligence.
Absolutely. These were operations conducted by Russian military intelligence, by the GRU. President Trump will be meeting with President Putin in the next couple of days, and one would hope that he would push back on the Russian president in that regard, who has clearly, I think, authorized these operations. But quite frankly, I don't hold out much hope that he will take this any more seriously than he has during the course of his presidency.
John Podesta, thanks very much for your time today. Of course,
thanks,
the victim of the hack right there. I want to bring in Chris Christie now as well. You just heard that last point, Chris, from John Podesta right there. The president briefed on this, according to Rod Rosenstein, earlier in the week. Do you believe this will or should change the president's stance toward Vladimir Putin in this summit coming up on Monday?
Well, it strengthens the president's hand for Monday. I think the president is now going to be able to say to President Putin, and I think he should and will, that we now have evidence of Russian military personnel who have been involved with the hacking of the accounts of people who were participating in the presidential election in 2016. So I do think this is an important bit of information to have been shared with the president. I'm glad that Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein shared it with the president prior to its release and prior to the president's departure from the United States, so that he could have that information before he goes to see President Putin. And there's no question, George, that this is powerful information that adds to the narrative which already existed, which is the Russians were attempting in some way to meddle with the election here in the United States. And this is something that I am confident the president is now going to raise with President Putin on Monday.
John Carl, let me bring you in on this as well. We heard from Rod Rosenstein during the course of his press conference that several Americans did correspond with these intelligence officers over the course of the campaign, over the course of the hacking, and though he says they didn't necessarily know, or there's no allegation in this indictment that they knew they were corresponding with Russian military intelligence. Also, no allegation in this indictment that any American citizens were cooperating with the conspiracy.
Yeah, clearly sending a message directly to the White House on those 2 points. Nobody knowingly, no Americans, I mean, certainly nobody associated with the Trump campaign, knowingly part of this, and nothing to affect the actual vote count. But George, as you remember, the president during the campaign said that the hacking could have been done by a 400-pound guy sitting on his bed. He has downplayed the Russian involvement on this continuously, even as president, even as he has had access to the intelligence. Now he is looking at an indictment that goes right to the GRU, that is Russian military intelligence, the largest foreign intelligence agency in Russia, directly at Vladimir Putin's feet, just as he is going to be sitting down at his summit meeting with Putin.
We'll see how he handles it on Monday. Final point for Pierre Thomas right now. No allegations in this indictment about American citizens, Pierre Thomas, but that leaves open the big questions. What is next for Robert Mueller?
That's right, George. The investigation is ongoing, but the dominant point from today's press conference is that the United States government is saying that we know precisely who in the Russian government was involved in this hack, and we know how they did it, and we know how they dispersed the information. They're naming and shaming. That's the bottom line today, George.
These indictments, 12 Russian nationals connected to Russian military intelligence. That means connected to Vladimir Putin, indicted today by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, announced by the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, just a few days ahead of this important summit meeting between the president and Vladimir Putin. We're going to stay on top of this all day long on abcnews.com. Full report tonight on World News Tonight with David Mueller. Have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.